Hi guys, welcome back. I hope that your test went well. I'm recording this before the test has even opened, so I'm not sure how you did, but I hope that it was okay for you. Hope that most of those questions were familiar and that you guys did okay on this one. I have a feeling that it's going to go better than the first one, obviously. So hopefully that's a good crutch for your grade. Something else that I did want to mention, so moving forward, I'm going to have the quizzes close and stop being available right after the due date. I might give like one extra day for late submissions for half credit, but I will start having those go away entirely um, right after the due date. So if you do want to use those to study, save them while you can. Save them right after you take the quiz because they won't be available to you whenever you're studying later on. And that's just because we're moving online, your test is online, it's gonna be hard for me to keep track of keeping them closed for people who haven't taken them yet, and it's just gonna be tough if I leave them open the whole time. So expect changes to that, expect quizzes to disappear after the deadline, and prepare for that so you can um, write those down in advance. If you have any questions about that, let me know. So today we are going over chapter 12, first chapter in this unit. Chapter 12 is over social psych, and it's one of my favorite chapters. I love to talk about it. I think it's super interesting. I encourage you guys to take an entire class on social psych because it's super cool. And every day in social psych, I remember having my mind blown. So definitely encourage you guys to look into it some more. So let's get rolling. So people usually ask, and sometimes I have a hard time understanding the difference between sociology and social psych. Well, the difference is that psychology is way cooler, but there's also differences in what they study and what they do. So um, sociologists are looking at the behavior of groups of people, whereas social psychologists are looking at individuals and how they interact with other people. So a sociologist might look at, why does the amount of riots increase at different times of year? What kind of community interventions can we implement to change that kind of thing? Looking at the behavior of groups. Whereas a social psychologist might look at persuasion and how it works on an individual. What makes persuasion work best? Looks at different dynamics between interpersonal relationships. Look at discrimination and how discrimination affects individuals and how they interact with how it affects the interaction between individuals. So that's kind of the difference. Sociologists are looking at groups as a whole and how to change behaviors of groups, whereas social psychologists are looking specifically at individuals and how they interact with other people. So one important topic in social psych is this idea of social thinking. So this is our kind of examination of what influences how we explain people's behaviors. Why do we think people act the way that they do? Why do they do things that they do in certain situations? And one of our ideas about how we explain people's behavior is this attribution theory. So we credit the behaviors of other people to two things. We either decide that they're acting that way because of their own personal disposition, because of their own characteristics, their own personality, their own doing, or we credit their behavior to the situation. So for example, when I see a student that doesn't talk in class, why don't they talk in class? I can attribute it to two things. Either it's their own personal disposition, they're shy, they're introverted, they just don't like to speak up in class. That's their own personal characteristic. Or I can attribute it to the situation. It's a weird day, the class is hard, the question is worded funny. So something about the situation causes that behavior. So I'm deciding between those two things, the person's disposition or the situation. Another example, seeing a homeless person living on the streets. Why are they living on the streets? Why is that their behavior? I can attribute it to two things. Either it's this person's disposition, they were lazy, they didn't work hard, or I can attribute it to the situation. So something about that person's situation caused them to become homeless. They were laid off from their job. They were, living in an underserved community as is, something like that. Something about the situation is causing that behavior. So having these two things to decide from, we often make what we call a fundamental attribution error. So this is our tendency when looking at other people's behavior to underestimate the situation and overestimate their disposition. So when I see a homeless person or someone who turned in a late assignment, we have a tendency to overemphasize their personal disposition. They're being lazy, they're being shy, they're not hardworking, and underestimate the situation. They had someone pass away, they were laid off from a job, something like that. So keep that in mind when you're making judgments about other people's behavior, that we do tend to overestimate their personal disposition and underestimate the impact of their situation. So there's a few things that affect the attributions that we make, the decision that we make whenever deciding why someone is behaving the way that they do. One thing could be our culture. A culture that has certain values might make certain attributions. So for example, if a culture really values respect, then they may be more quick to make an attribution error about someone running late. They may attribute that to being a personal disposition of being disrespectful versus looking at the situation and attributing it to traffic or an alarm not going off or something like that. Something else that influences how we make our attributions is whose behavior it is. We are, more likely to attribute lateness to a personal disposition to disrespectfulness if the person has done it in the past, if they've been disrespectful before. So we do look at that person and their previous behaviors when we decide what attribution to make to their behavior. There are also a few exceptions to our rule of overemphasizing personal disposition and underemphasizing the situation, especially when it comes to our own behaviors. So when we do something good, we like to attribute that to our own good reasons and our own good personal disposition, and not the situation. So, when you volunteer, you may attribute that to being a good person. That's your personal disposition as a good person, even though it might have been required for a class or something like that. When you help out a friend, you attribute that to you being a helpful person, when maybe you only did it to kind of speed them up because they were taking a long time. So the exception to that fundamental attribution error rule that we make is whenever we're looking at our own good behavior. And the attributions that we make matter. They really do make a difference. They have real consequences. A jury has to decide whether a shooting was malicious or in self-defense. Was it the situation or was it the person's disposition as a bad person? Our employers have to decide if someone they're interviewing is really a good, friendly person, or if they're only acting like that because of the situation that they're in. Our attributions also influence our political opinions, right? So conservatives are more likely to make dispositional attributions, thinking that people are doing certain behaviors because of their own disposition, whether it be they're unemployed because they're lazy, or they're poor because they didn't work hard. Whereas liberal people and social scientists are more likely to make a situational attribution. So believing that people have certain behaviors because of the situation that they're in. They're more likely to agree with statements like, if I had to live with the same poor education, lack of opportunity, and discrimination, I likely wouldn't be any better off either. So something to keep in mind. Attributions really do matter and influence our opinions and who we are. Something else that's important to consider in social psych is how our attitudes and actions are influenced. So we know that our attitudes affect our actions, right? How we think and feel about something affects what we then decide to do. And we know that because of persuasion, right? Persuasion is changing attitudes to then change our actions and behaviors. And we can persuade someone through two different routes. We have central route persuasion and peripheral route persuasion. So central route persuasion is persuading by giving evidence and quality arguments to change someone's mind. So this works best for people who are obviously already interested in the topic, want to know more, and want to have those facts and arguments to change their mind. But you can still persuade people who aren't as interested and who aren't really as willing to get all of those facts and hear those arguments through peripheral route persuasion still. So peripheral route persuasion is using persuasion by showing celebrity endorsements and flashy commercials and having people make these snap judgments just based on those cues. So it's a lot faster, but it's a lot more superficial. But both can be effective depending on what you're trying to do. So for example, to give an example of the difference between those, like my boy Leo DiCaprio is, as you might know, a longtime environmental advocate. And so him using his platform as a celebrity to persuade people to get on board with climate action is an example of peripheral route persuasion, just using that flashy celebrity endorsement to persuade someone. But Leo also has created a documentary about the subject called The 11th Hour. And the use of this documentary to give facts and evidence is an example of central route persuasion. So that's kind of the difference there. So persuasion shows us that our attitudes affect our actions, but we also know that our actions affect our attitudes. And one example of that is the foot in the door phenomena. So I think this is really cool. Our foot in the door phenomena is our tendency to comply to a larger request after first complying to a smaller one. So for example, the big study that kind of looked at this foot in the door phenomena had some researchers who were posing as safe driving volunteers. And what these volunteers were doing were going around and asking people if they could install these huge, not very pretty signs into people's yards that said drive carefully, huge signs. And only 17% of people agreed, right? It's a pretty small percentage of people. This is a huge, ugly sign. Most people don't want it in their yard. However, they approached other houses and first asked them if they would install a small 3-inch sign that said something similar, drive carefully. And most people said yes, right? That's a small request. I can do that, sure. Now, when they came back to those houses that first asked about a small sign and then asked those people if they would be willing to then install this huge, ugly sign, 76% of them agreed. So 76% of people agreed to do this after first being asked to do a small request, whereas only 17% of people did it when they weren't first exposed to that small request. So asking someone to first do something small and get your foot in the door will make people more likely to comply to that request, which I think is super cool. And this kind of illustrates how our actions affect our attitudes. Doing something becomes believing something. So when you need to ask someone for something big, it's a good idea to first ask them for something small first, because when we do something like put in a small sign, we're convincing ourselves that I must care about driving carefully. I must be a good Samaritan, a good community member, if I'm willing to do this. So when people ask me to do something more, I've changed my attitude about driving carefully. So of course I'm going to change my actions. I hope that makes sense. I think it's super cool. Look into it some more. If that didn't make sense, listen to it again. Sorry. I wish you guys were here to ask questions. Something else that also affects our attitudes is roles and playing roles. One big example of this is the Zimbardo prison study. You might have already heard about this. There's a movie about it on Netflix. I think it's called the Stanford Prison Study or Stanford Prison Experiment. Can't remember the name of the movie, but it's pretty cool and it's pretty accurate for the most part. So if you haven't heard of this study, Zimbardo and his colleagues were interested in finding out whether the brutality reported among guards in prisons was due to like a personal disposition, like sadistic people becoming guards, or if it had more to do with the prison environment, so the situation, assigning roles like that. So to test this, he built a mock prison, essentially, in the basement of Stanford, and then he asked college boys to come live in the prison for $15 a day. So he assigned half of them as guards and half of them as prisoners, gave them a role to play. And they were treated as such. The prisoners were picked up and arrested from their houses. They were photographed and booked into the prison. They were given uniforms with IDs, and they were only referred to as their ID number. And then guards were told to do whatever they thought was necessary to maintain law and order in the prison and to command the respect of prisoners. So easy request, right? Just act your role. And they were free to do whatever they wanted. They could have done nothing for 2 weeks or as long as the experiment was supposed to go on, and just sat around and been recorded. However, within hours, the guards were harassing the prisoners like to the extreme. They were waking them up in the middle of the night for counts. They were insulting them, giving them petty orders, making them do push-ups, took away their beds. Within 36 hours, one of the prisoners essentially had a mental breakdown and couldn't handle it anymore. And the study was supposed to last 2 weeks, but it only lasted 6 days because the guards were using such excessive aggression, and the prisoners were having breakdowns. So why did they do this, right? They could have done nothing for 2 weeks. They could have just made $15 a day sitting around. The guards could have been super chill and thought, woo woo, we just get to sit here in the basement. This is fun, this is great. But instead, they took that role that they were assigned, and this role influenced their attitudes towards other people so much and took it to such an extreme that the study had to stop. So this study was the first to really illustrate the power that assigning a role to someone has. And so some other examples you might see in your own life, like, giving an employee the role of employee of the month. Their attitudes change in that month. Their attitudes about themselves and about you might change and how they treat other people. I was substitute teaching in a class one time, and the teacher had assigned one student the role of talker tracker, and so they were supposed to write down the names of all the students who were talking whenever they were going to the bathroom. And that student that was assigned that role just felt so powerful and had these attitudes about themselves and about those other people that their behavior really changed because of the role that they were assigned. So the roles that we give people really do make a difference in our attitudes and our actions. Yeah, what that says. Okay, I lied. I actually do want to talk about the cognitive dissonance theory. So the cognitive dissonance theory tells us that when our attitudes don't match our behavior, there's kind of this tension or cognitive dissonance. So what we do is we often bring our attitudes into line with our behavior. So our attitudes kind of start to reflect our behavior, even if they didn't match in the first place. So for example, when segregation became illegal, or I'm sorry, yeah, when segregation became illegal, there was this disconnect between people's thoughts and what they were doing, right? So their attitudes were racist and they didn't want to treat people equally, but their behaviors had to kind of be the opposite. They had to start treating Black people equally. So their behavior and their attitudes didn't match. And that causes this dissonance, this tension. It doesn't really make sense for us to act in a way that doesn't line up with our attitude. So what we start to do is we start to bring our attitudes in line with that behavior. So slowly we see that people's attitudes start to shift, right? People start to become less racist over time because their attitudes is shifting more towards the behavior. This same concept can be used in terms of like people with depression and practicing healthy and loving self-talk. So when we force ourselves to say good self-talk and good things about ourselves, our attitude doesn't match that behavior. That doesn't make sense for us. So what we tend to do is start to believe what we're doing. So our attitude starts to kind of line up with that behavior, line up with that positive self-talk, and we start to believe that behavior, and our attitude starts to shift. So that's kind of the attitudes follows behavior principle. So we can kind of act ourselves into thinking a certain way, just as easily as we can think ourselves into acting a certain way. And so this video, I don't think I'm going to have time to show it to you, but I really, really want you to watch it, is this woman who's speaking on changing our attitudes about ourselves just by changing a little bit of our behavior. So standing in a certain pose, she calls them power poses, standing in a certain pose for even just a couple of minutes. Changing that small behavior can change our attitude about ourselves so much on a chemical level. We can change our thoughts and attitudes about ourselves just by changing our behavior, even if we don't believe it to start. So I really encourage you to watch it. It's a really good watch, and it can really show how much of a difference it can make just to change our behavior, to change our attitudes, even if you don't believe it at first. This is the video that I was going to show you, but watch it on your own, please. It's great. So what other social influences are playing a role whenever we are changing our attitudes or changing our behaviors? Well, one of those social influences is conformity. So this is our complying with social pressures, right? Behavior is contagious. We like to do what other people are doing. We conform to the group. And so we have a couple different types of conformity. We have suggestibility, and one aspect of suggestibility is social contagion, or the chameleon effect. So we are natural mimics. We do what we see other people doing. Researchers find that when you're sitting in a room with a Confederate, someone who's involved with the study, participating in the study, but you don't know that, when you're sitting in a room with a Confederate, participants will, without realizing it, start to mimic what they do. So they'll rub their own face when they see the Confederate rubbing their face. They'll bounce their leg. They'll yawn when they yawn, stuff like that. Same thing is can be said for mood. So people's moods are contagious, right? We find that we tend to feel the same way as other people around us. We're happier around happy people. We're sad around sad people. We match our mood to the way that someone is talking. Because we are just social creatures, this natural mimicry is so easy for us. It's so natural for us to match what others are doing. And it really enables us to empathize. It allows us to actually feel what other people are feeling. Empathetic people are actually more likely to do this. They do this natural mimicry even more. So they're more likely to yawn when you yawn, etc. And we see that empathetic, mimicking people are liked more, which is an interesting finding because maybe it is true that we like people who feel what we feel, who try to match what we're doing, because it's just more relatable. We're able to get on the same level and feel the same things. So this study looks at conformity in terms of giving answers on a test. So what Ash and his colleagues did, was had one participant come in and then had a few confederates, so people who were involved with the study, but the participant thought that they were just other participants. So what they did was they showed people these lines. So they showed them the line on the left, the standard line, and then they asked them, which line is the standard line most like? Which one is equal to the standard line? And so you would go down the line and you would ask the people what they thought, and they would give their answer. So Confederate 1 would go, Confederate 2, Confederate 3, Confederate 4, Confederate 5. They'd have lots of people. And all of the Confederates, all of the fake people involved with the study, would say line 3. Now, if you look at the lines, it's obviously line 2, right? So line 3 is obviously the wrong answer. However, more than a third of the time, these college students were willing to give the wrong answer, the obviously wrong answer, just to go along with the group, because they had just heard 5 other people give this answer. So they conformed to this answer a lot of the time. So they were more than willing to give a completely wrong answer just because other people had done it. So why do we do this? What's our reasoning for conforming with other people? Well, there's 2 big reasons: normative social influence and informational social influence. So sometimes we conform to what other people are doing just to avoid rejection or just to be socially approved of. So we all stand for the pledge. We all clap when other people clap. We might give a wrong answer just because 4 other people did it. So we are just trying to fit in and not be judged and to be approved of by other people. Another time that we might conform is when we want to accept other people's opinions about reality because we don't know what's right. So we don't know what to do. We might look at others and look to others and assume that what they're doing is right and follow their lead because we don't know what's right. So we might use this informational social influence to get information that we don't already have. So for example, if you've ever been like at the airport and your terminal changes, something goes wrong, you might notice one person in the group looks like they know what they're doing, and so they'll go somewhere else, and then you'll kind of see like a flock of people following this one person's lead because they don't know what's right. They don't know what to do, so they're using this social influence to inform their decision. They're conforming because they don't know what's right and they need to accept someone else's opinions as facts. So is conformity good or bad? Sometimes it's good when it takes us to the right airport terminal, but sometimes it's not when we're only giving a wrong answer because that's what other people are doing. So we know of a few things that make conformity more likely, and I'll just kind of read this list. So you're more likely to conform when other people make you feel incompetent and insecure, like you don't know what's right. Makes you more likely to use that informational social influence. When you're in a larger group, so the more people you have to defy, the more likely you are to conform with them. You're more likely to conform when you admire the group and the people in the group. You are more likely to conform when you haven't already made a prior commitment. So if you were to have already said an answer, then you would be less likely to conform to that wrong answer that other people had said. When you know that other people in the group will observe your behavior, so you might be less likely to conform if you can do it in private and in secret, but if you know that other people are watching, you're more likely to do it. And you're more likely to conform when your culture strongly encourages respect for social standards, which makes sense, right? If we really value going along with a group, then we're more likely to do that. So this one is another interesting study, and it's called Milgram's Obedience Study. So Milgram was a researcher who knew that people often conform to social pressures, but he wanted to know how people would respond to just downright commands, how obedient they would be. So he had participants come into a room with a researcher in a white lab coat, right? He looks very professional, looks like an authority figure. And then another fake participant, so a Confederate, right? Someone who is pretending to be a participant but is actually involved with the study. So the two participants would draw a card that either said student or teacher. And the Confederate was always the student, right? He was playing along, he was always going to be the student, and the real participant was always going to be the teacher. So the Confederate would have a job, and as the student, he would go behind the door, he would sit down and he would get connected to an electric shock machine. And the teacher's job was to sit on the other side of the wall and read a list of word pairs. And if the student got an answer wrong when reciting back the word pairs, the teacher's job was to administer a shock. He was told every time he must administer a shock. And then each time the student was wrong, the shock would get higher and higher in voltage. And they were blatantly labeled, like the participant knew exactly what the voltage was. And the voltage would go all the way up to like XXX is what it said, like deadly, do not go here. And he would have participants keep going in the study until they would either stop or the fake Confederate was presumed dead. So the shocks kept on getting higher and higher and higher until eventually the Confederate, the student who wasn't really hooked up to an electric machine, was begging for them to stop. Please stop. I have a heart problem. Please stop. I can't take this. Please stop. The teacher would look back at the authority figure. The authority figure would say, you must keep going. And they would. And almost all of the participants, I think it's 65%, obeyed those commands to continue until the student, the Confederate, was presumed dead. They were no longer responding to any requests. They were not speaking on the other side of that wall. So 65% of teachers fully obeyed the experimenter's commands to continue all the way until the end. And they did so despite the mention of a heart condition, despite hearing cries of protest, despite the fact that the machine said XXX, do not go here. And this study really shows the influence of authority figures and obedience. People are willing to obey an authority figure farther than they would ever go on their own, just because someone in a white lab coat told them to. So this was a really interesting study. It did bring up a lot of questions about ethics because people were, sometimes really upset afterwards because they thought that they could have potentially killed somebody. And that can be hard for anybody to process. So we're not allowed to do that kind of thing to participants anymore. You can't be, deceived in that way anymore. But it was a really powerful study at the time, and it told us a lot about what people are willing to do and how far they're willing to go if an authority figure says so. Hitler, right? That's how the Nazis happened, because of obedience. People just kept on going because the guy in charge told them to. And we know of a couple things that will influence obedience. So we are more likely to obey if the person giving orders is in close proximity to you. So like right on your tail giving you these commands and perceived to be a legit authority figure. So he was wearing a white lab coat. People might have taken him less seriously if he just looked like a grad student or something like that. People are more likely to obey if the authority figure is supported by a powerful or prestigious institution like a powerful university or the police department or something like that. People are more likely to obey when the victim was depersonalized or at a distance. So since the participant was behind a wall, they couldn't see them, they're more likely to obey. Same thing in like the Nazis, right? They're depersonalizing these people, calling these Jewish people horrible names, you know, making them seem less like people. That makes you more likely to obey to those types of commands. And when no role models are displaying any defiance. So there were no other participants around who defied the authority figure, the guy in the white lab coat, so they didn't have any role model that would show them otherwise. People might be more likely to not obey and to defy that authority figure if others are doing it as well. Something else that influences our behavior is the presence of other people. Our group behavior is different than our behavior would be alone, right? So a couple things that we see in the presence of others. One is social facilitation. So people perform better in the presence of others. Because they're being watched, right? They want to do better when other people are around. So we see that people have faster race speeds if they're racing other people than if they're just racing a clock. People, you know, do better in their individual performance if other people are around. And that's for obvious reasons, right? Because people are watching and we want to do better. However, if we're doing a group task with lots of other people, then we see this social loafing, which is actually the opposite. So we see a diminished effort on a group task. So social facilitation helps us when we're doing an individual performance and people are watching us at our own individual performance. But whenever we are doing something with a group, we see this social loafing where people give less effort. So for example, one study had people do tug of war blindfolded and they were told that they were on a team with lots of other people. And people only exerted a fraction of the effort that they did whenever they did the task alone. Because people in a group feel less accountable, they feel less identifiable, they're less worried about what other people think because they can blame it on the group and not just their own individual performance. So social loafing is kind of the opposite of social facilitation, where people give less effort when they're doing something in a group. This idea of de-individuation is kind of a mix of both. So we see de-individuation when the presence of others gets us hyped up, right? So just like that social facilitation, we're around other people, we're hyped up, we're gonna do more. But being in that group also makes us feel less accountable and more anonymous, like in social loafing. So when both of these happen at the same time, when we're all hyped up and we feel less accountable and more anonymous, then we get de-individuation. So we kind of lose our feelings of self-consciousness and normal restraints that we would normally have in certain group situations. So like in riots, or when people are screaming, going berserk at like a sporting game. We see this de-individuation because people are super hyped up from being around other people, like that social facilitation aspect, but they feel a lot less accountable and less identifiable because they're in a group, like social loafing. So de-individuation is kind of that mix of both in a group. Another concept is this idea of groupthink. So this happens when we're making a decision with a group and we prioritize group harmony and the group making one cohesive decision over making a good decision. So we want so badly for the group to get along and come to a unanimous decision that we don't give any dissenting ideas, we don't throw anything else out there, we don't suggest any changes. So we sacrifice thinking through all of the options and making the right decision, just so we can have that harmony in the group, which can hurt people a lot. I remember this exact thing, groupthink, happening whenever we came up with our idea for our study and experimental. We wanted so badly for us all to just agree that nobody really pointed out any of the problems with our idea. This happens in government all the time. People are constantly just trying to make a decision, write a bill that will pass, that they might not throw out as many ideas or come to the right conclusion because they just want everybody to agree. Also, being in the presence of a group and talking to a group of like-minded people strengthens our opinions. So, for example, like you see in this graph, people who talk to like-minded people just get more strong in their opinions either way. So if you are a highly prejudiced person talking to a group of highly prejudiced people, you're going to become even more prejudiced. If you are a low prejudice person talking to a group of low prejudice people, you're going to become even less prejudiced. Same thing is true for all kinds of any kind of like-minded group, any sort of politics really. So if like-minded Democrats talk, their views will become even further left. If like-minded Republicans talk, their views become even farther right. But group polarization can be a good thing in some contexts, in some certain circumstances. So like in self-help groups, for example, people who are like-minded talking to a bunch of people who agree about their progress and ways to get better, and people who all agree that they're working to get better. They'll all kind of reinforce each other's beliefs in themselves and strengthen their positive attitudes about the effectiveness of the group. So it can come in handy in some circumstances, but it can really polarize us in other ways. Yeah, so that's all I got for you on social psych. I think that this idea of social psych and how the presence of other people influences our attitudes, our actions, and how we think and interact, I think that's super cool. And if you take social psych, it'll go into a lot of those things even more and teach you even more than I can cover in one lecture. So I really encourage you to take social psych. I think it's cool. This lectures quiz will be up now, and you will have until Wednesday at midnight to take it. So good luck. Make sure that you write down any questions that you want to study for later, because they won't be available after the deadline. Shoot me an email if you have any questions at all. See you guys later.